forums, and if you are new to the forums, welcome. And I know many of you have been involved in these for the last few weeks. Welcome back. I want to welcome our speakers and basically say a few things about ground rules. We want to use the mute button at your site so we can prevent transmitting any background noise. If you do have a question during discussion, please submit it via the chat feature, and we will get to you as soon as we can during the flow of the conversation. And certainly if you have a major point to share, I want to make sure we get to that. And so get it to me, and we'll make sure you get recognized. And also, this forum is being recorded. I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who will now talk about today's learning objective and sort of what we're going to talk about a little bit.
Thank you, Deb. Good morning, everybody, and thank you once again for joining us. These discussions that we're having each Wednesday morning in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic have been really a value add, and that's all because of y'all. So thank you so much, and I think that we're getting good information out. I want to encourage everybody, if you have questions, get involved. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a chat function. There we'll be kind of just going in and out of those, answering questions, using those questions and directing them towards our subject matter experts. We want to make sure it's a value add for everybody, so chime in, let's get involved. Today we really want to discuss, just with all of the new news and the changes that are going about within our companies and our neighborhoods and our communities, what are some of the next steps? What are some of the things that you see in the crystal ball as far as how we're going to get things back to normal, and how, or in what stages or what practices are we going to use to get us all back up to speed? So we want to thank everybody for joining us. This situation's really been unprecedented, so let's make these relevant. Let's get involved, and if you have any questions, like I said, hit the chat button down below, and we'll be sure to get those questions addressed amongst the group. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Marilyn Stansbury. We have a number of subject matter experts to talk about next steps, and I'm going to pass it on over to Marilyn. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Deb and Paul, thanks for kicking this off. And I'm really excited that we have a couple of returning speakers, folks that were with us at the very beginning when we started these member forums, and now that we may be transitioning to yet another new normal, it's very appropriate to have them back on the call today. And we have a couple of new folks joining us. They've been on the call, but are going to be presenting some ideas and sharing their hot topics and next steps. Joining us today is Russell Tafoya. Russell is with Wayfield Group. He's a project executive with Wayfield Group Contracting and a member of the IECRM Board of Directors. Also, Kristin White, an attorney with Fisher & Phillips. Kristin has been amazing throughout the last 2 months, not only on screen but off screen in supporting us. Pete Aden, also a member of our Board of Directors and a CPA with Wipfli. And you may recall that we had Wipfli on a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the SBA and PPP program loans coming out. Also joining us is John Crawmer. He is the safety supervisor with Pinnacle Assurance, and John has been quite busy over the last 2 months keeping up with all the changes, things that are happening week by week, and keeping us on our toes for the things that we need to be doing in the workplace. And also Stephanie Wachman. Stephanie is an executive coach and a strategy extraordinaire. We work very closely with Stephanie. She's with Symmetry Strategies. And Stephanie's going to talk a little bit today as we start, again, addressing some of these transitions. Stephanie's going to give us some perspective about communication and corporate culture and how you keep everybody engaged as these changes continue to occur. With that, Deb, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Marilyn. This week's hot topics And the big news really is everyone's excitement or concerns about reopening business and adjusting to what's next. The governor has defined phases as response, which is where we are, stabilization, where we are going, and recovery. And what does that mean? We want to look at updates to policies for return to work and stay at home. We want to talk about new federal guidance on SBA payroll protection plan loans and other loan programs. Maybe touch on some tax treatment of federal COVID-19 relief. New updates and impacts to benefits, paid time off, and leave considerations. Anything with OSHA and CDC, new workplace safety protocols, and of course, absolutely communication and adaptation to what this could very well lead to, which are new company cultures. I'm going to ask each of you to basically, our subject matter experts, to basically give me and the group a perspective through your own lens on what is top of mind for you this week, because every week it does seem to change. And I'd like to start with you, Russell, because I know you also have a hard stop, but from a contractor's perspective, what's top of mind for you this week? What is really hot, and what are you really concerned with?
I wish I could say it was one thing, right? There's a lot to keep your eye on the ball with. So top of mind for us is making sure that we remain a healthy company and that we're managing, revenue and our but So there's a lot to be said there. There's a little anxiety, people eager to get back to the office. But we've learned that, through this period, we've worked really well remotely. So how long do we entertain that, right? Do we change our work policy in general, allowing some people to be more remote? A couple of things that really apply to this week are back to work plans in each division of our department, or each of our departments have participating through a task force to see what their department looks like going forward in the next few months or even the next year. It's easy enough to say that we've got enough space and distancing between one another from office to office that everybody could go back, but we still have some at-risk people, may not be in their best interest to go back. And, the way that we used to interact and company culture, what that looked like, events or, congregating in hallways, talking and, just jumping into somebody's office, just those habits need to change. So we're going to have a good understanding in our organization of who's in the building and when, and that for some groups, that's going to be shift work. Some people naturally aren't morning people. So maybe they run a PM shift or an afternoon shift. Even when I think about how we're managing jobs, we've got job sites where instead of, of course, your job office trailer may not have access to everybody in there. You might only have our superintendent, and then all the other meetings are happening a little more remote. So our field guys are using Teams a lot more as a means to communicate, and then stretch and flex still happens, of course, in all of those huddles in the morning, but there's just that separation. And we're concerned that that in the next months, how OSHA looks at job sites and how general contractors are viewing things. Does that create, more contract language that we've got to weed through? And so we're sensitive to that. But we don't want to see closures on job sites because of the way that other people are working on the job or ourselves. So we're maintaining CDC guidelines as much as we can. Those are the things top on mind for us.
Okay, great. I'm hearing two main things. One is how does this affect the culture and the way we interact with each other? And also, what are the regulations we have to adhere to and the safety standards we need to meet? I'd like to ask Stephanie to give us a little bit of her perspective on culture and communication based on some of the things that you just addressed, Russell.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you. It's a big deal right now, the whole corporate culture thing, because we're coming back to a different culture, or and a lot of the employees don't know that they're coming back to a different culture yet. They still have the same cultural mindset. So from a leadership perspective, you have to understand that this is actually a real test of your culture. And at this time, the most important thing to do is to be able to over-communicate what the purpose and the values are of the company as you move forward. And the other piece of it is to understand that all the employees, I mean, you're dealing with your own stresses of keeping the company afloat, but the employees, many, I don't know if with your organization if there has been furloughs or layoffs, but there's a lot of fear around whether or not we're going to have our jobs and the company is going to be stable and the company is going to be healthy. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is there's the fear that they have dealt with as a result of the virus itself. And there's also a fear of it that it's just not going to be the same, and how do they be? So from a leadership perspective, over communicating. For some of you, communication is very easy and very natural. For some of you, you might not like communicating and think that you have to communicate. Why do I have to communicate so much? But this is the real message, and I've given this to a lot of my clients, is to answer the question of who, what, where, when, why, and how on a recurring basis. You know, be really clear about what's involved and how we're going to do this and how we're going to get through this and what we're going to do, and do it more than you think you need to. If you think that you're over communicating, you're not communicating enough. So that's what I would say in terms of the messaging. And also speak to your employees or have your managers speak to their teams in a way that they are asking of them, what do they need? How do we want our culture to be? Ask it from your employees so that they can communicate it back to you, and use that messaging as part of your shift in culture. So that's where I would start.
Thanks. Kristin, how about we now add the lens of OSHA and workplace safety on top of all of this, and how these are going to all come together to really begin to make things go smoothly.
Sure. Thanks for having me back, everybody. And man, my allergies are kicking in full force today. You know, it's a good question. We've seen from, especially here in Colorado, from local OSHA, that they really are taking the guidance that they got from federal OSHA, you know, about good faith efforts. And we've really seen that in effect here. So, you know, OSHA has told us they've had a lot of complaints from employees about work sites, but they're primarily responding to those with letters. You know, and they're really looking at what good faith efforts employers are taking to try to meet the obligations. You know, so, you know, I appreciate Stephanie's comments. I actually was taking some notes there as well. And I think part of that is just, you know, the continued communication on the safety side of, you know, what you're going to continue to do to comply with the guidelines as we slowly, you know, relax them and go back to work, as far as, you know, we're going to continue the face coverings, and we can talk more about that today. You know, we're going to continue social distancing. And I think that communication, because that's really, from the OSHA's perspective, that's what they're looking for. And what we've heard is, you know, that we're still, you're trying to follow those guidelines. And if you can't follow social distancing, what are you doing to try to ensure safety? I mean, Nevada, I think I mentioned this last week, Nevada's gotten really serious about it. I saw yesterday where they've even put out documents that you have to do a written JHA for any task you can't do social distancing for. We haven't seen that from the feds. I don't anticipate that we will, but that's something to keep in mind, that, you know, like a state plane has done, is they're doing JHAs. So that way everybody understands this is how we're going to keep you safe if we can't do social distancing. So, you know, I think playing along Stephanie's theme of communication, I think is going to be what's important. Because that's really what OSHA is looking for here, is that your employees are informed, they know what you're doing, and you're following those. And if you can't, then you come up with some other solutions.
Okay, thanks, Kristin. The other piece of this, of course, is a lot of the discussion around new legislation, hopefully that will be passed today to provide additional funding for the PPP. And I think there are a lot of questions about that loan program as well as other loan programs. Pete, we're waiting for additional guidance from the federal government on the payroll protection plan loans. And I think some of the questions are, if you have already received your loan as of the 20th, Monday of this week, and you have payroll scheduled for, later this week, Friday, using the first 2 weeks of the month. How is this payroll counted toward the loan since it's dated after the disbursement? There are just tons of confusing things around this.
Yeah, I wish I had a lot of really good answers. Unfortunately, I don't. We are hopeful that the additional funding comes through for the PPP loan. Do think that's going to happen. The SBA is supposed to issue additional guidance on April 26th, so that's coming right up. That's the Sunday. So that will give us some more guidance. The question you're asking there, Deborah, is really a cash versus an accrual question, which has not been addressed by the SBA. You only have 8 weeks to actually spend the money. So, and the countdown starts as soon as you get it. So, we can guess, which is always a great place to start with money that you may be forgiven or not. The thing is that if you have to spend it in 8 weeks, you want to make sure that you're using it for the right purposes. And so payroll is obviously one of those. That's what it was really intended for. So the gut answer is yes, you would use it for that payroll. Be sure, I think the most critical thing is going to be the documentation that is needed to then provide essentially back to the bank, who will then provide it to the SBA in order to get that loan basically forgiven. And so then the next question I think that comes up a lot about that is then what is the taxability of this loan that's forgiven? And they've really come out and said, hey, it's not intended to be a punishment. The question is that will it net to zero, meaning, hey, it will offset those expenses that you used to pay with the loan, those proceeds, or will we actually get to take those as a deduction, and therefore it's really a very much larger win in that regard. So looking again for more clarification from the SBA, I think a lot of those questions are going to get answered on the 26th because everybody's been just hammering the same thing to them.
Yeah. There's also some question about how the state of Colorado will respond to any of these loans that are forgiven, in part or entirely. Is there a tax liability there at all?
Historically, what the state of Colorado has done is followed what the Fed has done with those type of things. So fully anticipate that Colorado is going to just stay in step with the IRS on that. That's one of the nice things about being in Colorado is that it is follows so closely to the IRS guidelines. But you could see contractors in other states or who are in multiple states who each state obviously can treat it however they see fit. So you could have part of it forgiven in one state, and if you were in another state, it may be taxable. That's completely possible.
Okay. So one other question, when we've got a couple questions here specifically about employee compensation and getting paid on the Families First Act because they have the virus. Does this have to be separate from payroll, or can an employer use the PPP to pay the employee? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, you can't do both. You can't use both programs. So you have to only use one. So if you're using the PPP program, that follows those guidelines. If you're going to use, I guess the easiest way to say it is you can't double dip. So you can't use this one and that one and therefore double dip. So you have to pick and choose which one you're using. So you'd have to essentially carve that out of the PPP if you were going to use the other act. Okay,
and the FFCRA is the other act, right? Yeah. That's separate. Okay, and if an employee does, Tim has asked this question, if an employee does qualify for that, how quickly do those payments or should those payments be made?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I'm willing to throw out a guess. I would anticipate that it would go with the normal payroll processing. The whole goal there is to keep everybody on the payroll and keep everything moving and keep the funds flowing. But I don't know that for sure. That's a guess.
I can answer that. I can jump in on that one too, Deb, if you want.
Okay, go ahead, Kristin.
Yeah, I mean, Pete's got a good guess. So it is, I mean, it is the next payroll. I mean, we've actually had some employees that you may need to go back and pay. So because the law went into effect April 1. So if you've had an employee who, you know, had been out for a few days and not getting paid because they were out on sick leave, say, you know, for the last week, and you just found out that, oh, they, you know, they were diagnosed with COVID, or, you know, the childcare issue, you would need to go back and pay them for those days. So you know, it doesn't go past April 1, right? It's not retroactive that way, but it could go back to last week if you just found out they qualified. But yeah, you'd want to put, like Pete said, just in the normal payroll, like you would treat any other kind of PTO leave. But here, like I said, if you find out that they qualified last week and they've been at home without pay, you'd want to pay them for those days.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to get John in here and have you tell us, John, from your perspective, what is really top of mind and hot in terms of this week and maybe the next few weeks going forward.
Yeah, sure. Hi, John Crawmer with Pinnacle Assurance Safety. Thanks. You know, the top of mind is do a risk assessment. You know, what does it look like to have employees return to the workplace? Since construction is an essential, critical aspect of our infrastructure here in Colorado, what is kind of unique for us is we're still working, right? It just may be that our office personnel and professionals might be telecommuting more. So I really liked the comment about more communication. Some leaders and such, they do the morning stand-ups. Some leaders choose to do a stand-up at the end of the day because everything's hypothetical in the morning, right? It's like, let's do a stand-up and talk about what we're going to do for the day. So some leaders are actually flipping that and saying, you know what, let's do a stand-up at the end of the day and find out what were our goals that we achieved, and then what were our obstacles. So, you know, with regards to COVID, that approach can be very helpful, having that. It may seem, as from the leader's perspective, it may seem redundant, but again, people want to know what's going on. And, you know, as a business leader for your organizations, they need that comfort and that consolation that you're there to help them, you're there to help protect them. Other top of mind things is Pinnacle's been getting some inquiries about, oh, somebody was telecommuting or they were off during this time and they got injured. Is that work related? How does that pay, right? So how do claims work during this time? Our advice is call Pinnacle, talk to a claims representative, file a claim if necessary. Keep in mind, from a work comp perspective, NCCI does not calculate $0 claims into your experience modification rating. So, you know, we're here to help and so leverage that. But with regards to returning to work, we've really been analyzing the broad spectrum of different industries that Pinnacle serves, specifically with construction. I think, you know, is OSHA going to say that this is a work-related injury if you're performing essential job functions? Generally out on a job site, maybe not. But what if you're working in a healthcare facility? What if you're tasked with going into a long-term care center? So, you know, there's a lot of different types of occupancies and situations that need to be evaluated. So just do that risk assessment. It's often called a job hazard analysis. And you know, there's free templates online there to help out. Another thing you should be aware of is that Pinnacle is offering free safety consults virtually to anybody in the state. They don't have to be a Pinnacle customer. So if you're not a Pinnacle policyholder, feel free to give our safety team a call.
Okay, thanks, John. How about we break down the three phases of this opening up America again, which is really kind of what we're talking about here. Phase one, of course, is the response. Here's where we are today. And I'm hearing everybody talk about the fact that you really need to do a risk assessment and start to modify the workplace. Is there anything in particular from each of your perspectives that should be considered and adapted for a phase one move, which is where we are right now? Stephanie, do you want to start with communication? Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. I didn't want to be the first one to jump in because I have a lot to say about this. And Chris, I really want to be on that beach you're at. It looks lovely. What I wanted to talk about was a couple of things. One is for those employees who are working from home. In the beginning, this was a crisis mode of work from home. So people were, created habits and behaviors that are not necessarily healthy ones for the long term, because they're working all hours and trying to get things done. And part of the whole work at home thing is to start to think about some policies around working from home that are in the best interest and benefit to the employees. So if you have employees that are sending you emails at 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning because they haven't turned it off at all, this is the time to say, okay, bumpers, we have boundaries when we're working from home from this time to this time, take these breaks. But expectation is that we're not receiving emails unless it's absolutely emergencies at 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's one piece of it in terms of establishing boundaries around working from home, because employees tend to work actually more from home and do burn out because they are working all the time. So that's one thing. The other thing I would like to add is that there's going to be all kinds of changes and all kinds of things going on, but for an organization to make sudden changes and sudden rules is probably not in your best interest. Take note of things that are happening, but don't make any sudden changes to policy or procedure unless it's in the health and best interest of the employees. And lastly, use your knowledge right now. Take as much content and information as you can from what's happening to plan for the future, because it's likely that this is going to pop up again, and you want to have some understanding of what your corporate strengths are and ask your employees, because should this happen again, you actually want to have the right plan in place moving forward. So that's what I wanted to add to that.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. One question that just came through, and I think we're all starting to think about this because it has happened. When you have an employee who has self-furloughed, actually electing not to work during this shutdown because they are afraid of contracting the virus, how do you treat that employee as you try to move back to a level of stabilization? What are the issues around that? Self-furlough, does that mean they can come back? And how do we, what is the perspective we should have as employers?
Deb, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, we had talked a little bit about this, I think, last week about the work refusals, and that it's really a similar type of process. But one thing I was just thinking about, as employees are coming back to the workplace, which dovetails in with this question, is, you got to start thinking about the ADA and accommodations. You may have employees asking for reasonable accommodations based on serious health conditions. And so that's something, you want to take into account, and, you're going to have to think about that. But if they don't have, the underlying health condition or something that would prevent them from coming back to work, then you're going to go through that work refusal analysis of having the conversation with the employee about, why don't they want to come back to work? What can you do to alleviate their fears? You're going to walk through what you're doing to make sure they're safe in the workplace, with the face coverings and social distancing and, hand washing, whatever steps you've got in place to try to alleviate their concerns and get them back in the workplace, and, have that conversation with them, document that conversation of what you explained to them and what they came back to you with, what do they need to come back to the workplace? I mean, it may be that you say, no, we're not going to be able to accommodate that, but ask that question and have that conversation. But it may get to the place where you're telling them you're going to have to replace them if they don't come back to the workplace, if you're getting people back. But, you know, before you get there, you're having that dialogue forth with them. They come back.
Yeah. So, you know, really that employee could conceivably refuse to come back to work, period, right? And it could be for a whole host of reasons. One, they've got, you know, other health issues, or it could be an age thing, where they're feeling in the more vulnerable category. So as we look at the next phase, and let's be construction industry specific for phase 2, which is stabilization, what are the things we need to do to decide how and when to reopen and move forward? Is there, you know, anything from the insurance perspective, from the workplace regulations and safety perspective? How about financial considerations? Who would like to jump in on that one? I'm going to say Pete.
You know, it's a great question. We have the same question for our office as well, as when are we going to do that? When are we going to reopen? Obviously, from a financial impact, there's obviously large considerations of, you know, the productivity that people are gaining or losing from working from home, and you know, what does that mean for our financial statements? The impact of that is likely going to be significant. You know, there's just so much on projects. If they're pushing out, we're starting to see a large number of those actually happening, where projects are being delayed significantly and causing big holes for manpower. I really don't have a good answer for what that is going to look like in the near future, but excited for it to come, that is for sure.
One of the things I think that's available, and we'll certainly make sure that all of you have the link to it. Fisher and Phillips has done an incredible job of putting together an FAQ on policies for returning to work or staying at home. Kristin, would you like to talk about that FAQ just a little bit, because it does go through all three phases of, you know, recovery, stabilization, and then where we go from here.
Sure. I've been digesting it myself this week. But what we tried to do was kind of cover the gamut of the issues to think about from the employment perspective when you're coming back to work. And it's available on our main webpage, fisherphillips.com. So, but when you go through it, it basically kind of walks you through all of these questions about, you know, similar to what we were talking about with accommodation. How do we bring people back? Are we letting people work from home? I mean, it really tries to go through, you know, excuse me, wage and hour issues. If you're going to be taking everybody's temperature, because that, you know, not just the logistics and the safety side, but you've got medical information, the wage and hour issue that raises. So to really try to kind of hit on all of the human resources and employment issues as you walk through it. So yeah, so happy to talk more about it, but that was really the idea, putting that together, was try to hit on different disciplines, bring it all into one document. So hopefully that, you know, you can use that as a resource. And if it's, you know, raises certain issues you haven't thought about, it gives you some, you know, not just the issue, but the guidance on some suggestions on handling that.
Yeah, it kind of runs the gamut from what kind of work site cleaning you need to undertake prior to reopening to what precautions you need to put in place for individuals who are taking the temperature of employees as they come back to work, and can you take people's temperatures as they come back to work? How do you handle face coverings and whether or not an employee wants to wear a face covering? Can you mandate that? Should you provide them? So it's a very, very good resource. I'd like to shift for a second, though, to now insurance considerations. John, is there new thinking about what kind of coverage employers in construction and electrical contracting need to start to think about?
Well, that's a good question. I'm sure Kristin could probably chime in on that. With Pinnacle being workers' comp provider for Colorado employers and beyond, we exclusively offer work comp. So yeah, there may be other lines of coverage that employers should consider. And just to support what everyone is saying here, that, bringing employees back to work and evaluating the risks, something very simple that can be included is when you're doing your work site inspections, do you actually have a component on there for, COVID-19 related or just illnesses in general, right? That really should be a component. I mean, OSHA has always required workplace safety audits or inspections in the construction industry. So I think it's important that if we're putting forth a good faith effort to control the risk, regulatory agencies, they're going to recognize that, right? And if that also, to piggyback back on that other conversation about employees' refusal to work, OSHA's directive is that, is there an imminent danger? And I think it's critical that employers understand what that implies is like, is there really an imminent danger for my employee to perform this work? And is it going to be an illness due to COVID-19, right? So that when we're talking about risk assessment, those are some questions we should be asking. And finally, when we are using disinfecting products, are our workers trained according to the HAZCOM standard on how to properly use some of those products and disinfecting, right? I mean, we just throw all this order up an Amazon order and here's all of your disinfecting wipes and such, but it's just, it's a little humorous, but the reality is, let's be sure our workers are trained, make sure our HAZCOM programs are up to date as we're using those products.
You would think with the flu being something that we deal with on an ongoing basis every single year, that we would have had these conversations in this kind of detail well before this. I know it's a different situation with COVID because it is so highly contagious and it does spread so quickly, but it just comes back to the whole issue of safety in the workplace. And John, I think you also brought something up in a comment that you just sent in, which is creating psychological safety. That is like the buzz phrase now. And I think on the work site safety part of it, the whole psyche of the employee, the culture and the attitude around the culture, all come into play in terms of psychological safety. Who would like to kind of dissect that one for me? Stephanie. Thank you.
So the science around fear is very, very clear. When people don't feel threatened or feel fearful, they are producing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in their body, and this neurochemical, when confronted with fear, is always going to put them into fright, flight, freeze, or appease. It's a state that you go into, and many of us are already in that state of that fear. And the idea is, from a leadership perspective, is how can you reduce that fear? Because when you are at that level, if you're not feeling safe, what's going to happen is your brain function actually gets reduced. You don't think as clearly, you don't problem solve as well, you don't connect the dots as well, and you don't connect with others as well. And part of the challenge that we're facing is this whole lack of connectivity with people. So when I can talk to you and I can sit down with you, that reduces my stress levels. So creating a culture and an environment of safety is going to be really challenging for leaders, but also really critical for reducing that stress level for them. And the way to do that, and I'll come back to what I said earlier, is through over communication and sharing the vision and sharing the values and the purpose of the organization. No matter if you're on site or if you're in the office, if your mission and values are very clear and you can continually communicate that to the employees, but that it's true, right? If you're not authentic and it's not true and they're feeling not safe and threatened, then it's never going to work. But the idea is that the more that your employees feel like they are safe and cared for and valued, the less that adrenaline and cortisol they're going to deal with. And so when you have more dopamine in your body from a neurological perspective, when you feel calmer after like meditating or whatever, you feel calmer, you actually problem solve better and your trust levels increase. And that's the whole piece of it, is that when you feel threatened, your trust gets reduced. When you feel safe, your trust goes up. And so that's the challenge for, in the proper forms of communication. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, well, it starts to, and I think everything that we're talking about from site safety, financial, and psychological factors, they all come together to kind of put that safety net in place that makes one feel better. But the whole thing is about, you've got to communicate about what you are doing to mitigate any kind of vulnerability or concerns about safety at the work site and in working with each other. So I guess I'm hearing you say you have to over communicate on what OSHA requires and what we're doing in order to meet and exceed those requirements. You have to over communicate on the financial side of things and on the way we're looking at workers' compensation and safety. But here's the question that just came in, which goes back to employees doing the math, which I think David from Encore talked about a few weeks ago. If the only issue for a self-furloughed employee is general fear of getting the virus, and there are no other issues in place except that they heard that companies are getting money to pay them during this crisis, and they feel they should stay safe, so they're going to not work, get paid, and actually, why should they come back to work and even take the risk if that's the case? Krista, do you want to grapple with that one?
Yeah, I mean, that is something that we've been hearing, as employees, they'd rather, can we just stay home and get paid? I mean, the issue there becomes, how do you keep the employees on the work site? Because right under the PPP program, you're supposed to be paying everyone, and keep everyone on the payroll. And it'll be interesting when we see, to Pete's point, some of the SBA guidelines that come out on Friday, because we've been talking to employers about, do you increase wages for those coming back? Do you offer bonuses? And trying to get a little creative to say, I've got one employer who has just said, we're not going to pay people if they're not working. And then we'll deal with that issue on the back end with forgiveness. If we've got everybody back on the payroll or got the numbers back on the payroll by June 30th. So, I think you go back to, you have to address that employee. You've got to, get to the point of keeping your workforce in, and, how do you get creative? And I think I'd like to hear kind of from Pete if he's had some ideas on that as well. But that's what we've been trying to talk to people about, of getting creative on the wage side to avoid that issue.
Yeah, Pete, and then John, you have a perspective on this too. So take it away, Pete.
Yeah, we've definitely been struggling with that with clients who are trying to weigh, company culture versus this loan forgiveness. And I think it's important to remember that on the loan forgiveness piece, if the loan isn't forgiven, you received a loan with a 1% interest rate. So that's not a bad loan to have on the books anyhow. So seeing a lot of people say, basically what Kristin was alluding to is, yeah, we're not going to pay you to just stay at home. So that's not our company culture. Now, we may pay you to straighten up the shop, which is something we normally wouldn't do, but as long as you're being productive and working, we're willing to pay you. But just refusing to come in, that's not really our company culture.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Now, John, you just referenced a number of things here in the chat from OSHA. about the right to refuse. Would you like to explain some of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration obviously was promulgated in 1970, and it was put in place to help balance out the hazards in the workplace, right? I mean, at one time in our nation, employers maybe were perceived as taking advantage of employees and putting them in a hazardous situation. And so then this act was created, and whether we agree or disagree with it, what the act says is that back to that term, imminent danger, right? So an employee can refuse to work if there is perceived imminent danger situation, and if the employee refuses to work in a they perceive that there's genuinely an imminent danger. And a reasonable person, like all of us on the call today, would agree that there is a real danger of death or serious injury, and that due to the urgency of the hazard, to get it corrected through regular enforcement channels such as requesting an OSHA inspection, there's not enough time to do that, right? So they're like, you know what, I'm not going to work here. The employee might say that. Then the employee should ask the employer, you, the business leader, to correct the hazard or to assign other work. And that's a key component, because if we have good relationships with our employees, generally like if we have a reasonable, good dialogue with our employees, we usually don't see them refusing to work in this antagonistic relationship. Kristin can probably attest to that. There's times where we see OSHA complaints, and it's usually because of something else, like they're unhappy about another workplace condition, and it maybe not even really be safety related. So that's why I think Stephanie, to support what she said, she brought up such good points about reinforcing this high level of communication, consistent communication, so that we help diffuse and calm that fear down and create that psychological safety in the fact that if it gets so elevated to the point that they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get COVID-19 just from going to install a receptacle in some, whatever it is, right? The reality is, let's have a conversation with our employees and ask them, is there truly an imminent danger situation here? And there's so many different scenarios. I can't get into the details now, but back to what I said earlier, what is the type of work that's going to be performed as the skilled worker is going to go to work that day? Is it just doing a regular commercial project, or is it entering somebody's home who could be at risk for infection, or in a long-term care center? See what I mean? So all of these perspectives should be evaluated, and let's just keep those lines of dialogue open to really understand the situation. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think it really is challenging, because it is the word psychological and safety don't always go together, and psychological or whatever is going on in your mind can taint or color everything that you think about what is going on and whether a place is a safe place for you to be. Anybody have any other parting comments, as we are getting down to about 10 minutes left on the whole issue? I think psychological safety is going to be the whole buzz phrase going forward. Stephanie.
Yeah, I want to add one more component to this. I think that for those in management and leadership, to have your messaging clear across the board is really important. So to make sure that in the whatever the message is that it's consistent across the board, and you're taking into account that things are changing. I think Marilyn said it to me the other day, which I love. She's like, we're building the wings while we're flying. And that's true. And to share that with the employees, that we are building the wings as we're flying. Things are changing rapidly. But the message is your safety is our priority, so that you're reinforcing that you have their best interest and their health in order to provide them with that psychological safety. But the message has to run across the board. So whether or not somebody is working on a site location or in the office, that the message is consistent across the organization.
Yeah, and what that means is you have to make time to think that through. It's not, I mean, we all often think that we are able to communicate easily, but it's very, very difficult to make it consistent. And sometimes leaders wing it, and that's not a safe practice at all, because it can really go south on you quickly. So a couple more things before we go. John is referencing a document from the Colorado Department of Health, multi-industry construction guidance, and he has put the link here in the chat, which we will make available to you. John, tell me a little bit more about this document.
Oh, sure. Just very briefly, CDPHE did release a document that gives some great bullet point list of actionable, relatable COVID-19 protection measures that we in construction can utilize. In particular, the social distancing, it gets into more detail about that, hygiene protocols, how to properly monitor health and avoiding travel for high-risk personnel, and then critical activities and identifying what's truly urgent or not. So just a couple things. One last point I did want to make is, if you have had employees who are maybe not doing their routine tasks for the last couple months, it might be appropriate to do a little job orientation with them. So if they're performing tasks that are unusual, out of their normal routine, please make sure you're doing some type of familiarization or orientation with those new employees. They may not be new to the industry, but they might be doing something different that can potentially elevate the level of risk for us as human beings, right? When we're doing something different. So, and then if you do that, always document it. Make sure we sign and date something. Otherwise, OSHA says it didn't happen, right?
Right, right. Okay, I would like to ask our subject matter experts if anyone has any closing comments they'd like to make, or if any of our members here participating in the forum have a final question or need to have something answered. Pete.
So I guess the one thing I would say is, if you haven't received your PPP loan yet, or you had applied and it didn't get funded, be sure to have all of your ducks in a row again in case this does go through like we think it will, so that you can be kind of first in line again for the PPP loan.
Okay. Kristin, any closing remarks on your end?
Just one last thing I was thinking about. It'd been brought up earlier about contracts with your general contractors. And I do think that's going to be something you want to visit in the coming weeks of, how are you, who's covering the hand washing stations, and how are you handling exposed workers? We had an issue with the contractor yesterday that, they were following the relaxed CDC guidance for essential workers, where even if you've been exposed, if you can do social distancing and use the mask, they can come back on site. And the general contractor said, this guy's got to go home for 14 days. And so, I encouraged them to share. I said, well, maybe they just don't know about this guidance. Let's have this conversation. So make sure that, you're either having that conversation with your general contractor, or, if you're going on other people's sites, of how they're handling exposed workers, how you're handling it. And make it, like I said, make it to the point that these become contract terms. And, depending on how long we're in, in this area where we're doing social distancing and these different guidelines, but something to make sure you're addressing when you're coming on other sites.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, any final comments?
I think the only thing I would add is that there's two pieces. One is, for those of you in positions of leadership where you're kind of dealing with all of this stuff, know that you're probably under a tremendous amount of stress yourself, and to find a way to manage that so that you don't burn yourself out, because your employees need you big time right now. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is to also acknowledge the elephant in the room when you're talking to your teams and saying that, you know, things are scary, things are unpredictable right now, so that it's not like they can't talk about it or bring it up.
Yeah, and I think that you know, we have covered so much today, and I think barely scratched the surface of all of the things we need to consider in each of the 3 phases. But break it into the 3 phases and look at all of the legal, all of the safety, all of the communication aspects of it, and be prepared to revisit that regularly, because things are going to change and you're going to have to change as they do. So I want to thank our subject matter experts for being here today and for providing a whole lot of food for thought. I'd like to have Paul talk about next week's forum, and then Marilyn will wrap us up.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, great discussion today. Lots of information. Thank everybody for getting involved and chatting. Good participation today. It's great to see everybody tuning in and getting connected. I did want to make an announcement about next Wednesday's meeting. The member forum will actually be a safety forum, where we're bringing in Xcel Energy and 811 and talking about our standard safety protocols when it comes to locating utilities and best practices and communication connections to ensure that it's done safe. So next week's meeting will not be of a COVID-19 subject matter. It will be back to our standard safety forum with Xcel and 811. So you will see an invite for next week, but it'll be an invite for the safety forum, not a COVID-19 forum. So I just wanted to make sure I just got everybody that information before we jumped off today. Having said that, once again, great information today. Let's take the information that we've gathered, let's put it into play, and let's take a week and see how it's working out and come up with some new questions, and we'll be able to jump back into these sections the following Wednesday.
And one final reminder before I hand it back to Marilyn. If you have questions, I know the subject of licensing, CEUs, and testing are still very much on everyone's radar. If you have questions for Dora, we will get those answered for you if you send those in to Marilyn, so that we can submit them in writing. And speaking of Marilyn, handing it to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Again, one of the things that happened this week that I was so excited about is that I started getting a few direct questions from members that wanted us to address questions or thought of things from our previous forum that they had questions about. So please continue to do that. Email me. It helps us put together the right mix of our subject matter experts, who I want to thank today. A great diverse group. But lots of synergy among these levels of expertise. As Paul mentioned, 811 next week, although I've got to imagine that even 811 locates have been impacted by COVID-19. So I'll be interesting to hear what Xcel and team have to say about the impact from that perspective. And do continue to keep us on the radar on Wednesday mornings. We're going to continue to do this as long as we are in response or stabilization mode, and I really appreciate everybody's time. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.